Welcome to the LowCarbUSA podcast, where we seek to inspire you to help us build this community. I'm Doug Reynolds.
And this is Pam Devine. All right, welcome everybody. Today we're really excited. We have Dr. Joan Ifland, PhD, with us today to talk about a really interesting topic. We've had her at the last 3 or 4 conferences, and it's just such a interesting topic. But she has a very personal story about how she got into, and I'd like her to share that with us. Thanks so much for joining us today, Joan.
Oh, thanks for having me, Pam. I appreciate what you all are doing so much. You are a force for reducing suffering in the world, and I'm on your page.
Yeah, that's exactly sums it up, like why we're doing it. So yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah. My story really starts with my grandfather. He owned a candy store. He was an immigrant from Wales, and he had one daughter, my mother, and I think she was spoiled. She came into motherhood without really knowing how to cook. I was born in 1951, and we were already a convenience food household. So my dad worked for a consumer products corporation. He was a PhD biochemist, and so he was a researcher. And we got like these samples of things to try. I remember, I can tell you what was in my refrigerator, my family's refrigerator. It was all processed foods. It was all processed foods. And I can tell you what I had for breakfast. And it was all processed foods, with maybe some eggs and bacon added in. And she would make dinner. So we had a proper cooked dinner every night. My dad would come home at 5 o'clock and we would sit down and we would eat a cooked dinner. So we did not have a processed dinner, but sometime during the afternoon, a dessert would have been made. So there was a dessert, some big amount of sugar flour made in that household every day. And these 3 children and the 2 adults consumed all of it every 24 hours.
Wow.
So there was a huge amount of refined carbs, dairy, processed fats. I mean, we had those cans of Crisco in our house, and we made those baked goods out of Crisco. We had margarine in our house. We didn't have real butter in our house. And I think what has been so startling to me as I get into the field of processed food addiction is the amount of dysfunction in our house that created. We fought all the time. Everybody was always walking on eggshells, waiting for somebody to erupt. And it could even be me. I have a memory of just this really intense fury at my sister that I don't think is normal. So we fought all the time. The 2 parents fought with each other, they fought with us, and then the kids fought with each other. It was a horrific household to grow up in. We had, and then both my parents smoked. They both drank alcohol, and they both drank caffeine. And we were not, because fortunately we're not allowed to have caffeine. It might have killed somebody. I don't know. So growing up in that household was quite traumatic. There was nobody to connect to. Processed foods not only create anger, but they also create brain fog and fatigue and depression. And my mother was just felled by all of those things. She simply wasn't available to raise us. Like she was concert quality pianist. She was a music major. She had her own baby grand piano in this row of ticky-tack housing that we grew up in. And she never taught us to play. I would try to teach myself from a book. She could hear me trying to teach myself. She never once came down to that piano and sat down with me and taught me. She was in her own world. And I believe today that it was a world that was really formed by processed foods. The brain fog, the depression, the irritability, and the fatigue. Like my image of her is she's lying on the sofa in the living room. And this is the 1950s. So those two things firmly are connected in my mind. My sister once told me that, yeah, the candy bars in her purse were right next to the antidepressants and the allergy pills. So very early on, she was already on medication for the depression. She got us therapy. So in the 1960s, when it was still shameful and something that you hid, she found a social worker who worked for a psychiatrist, and we would go in there, and it was so traumatic. So we would all tell on each other, and then there would be no resolution, and we would go home knowing that all hell was going to break loose when we got home, because we talked about something that our parents didn't know about, or vice versa. It was horrific. It was horrific. So if you looked at that household today, you would, with what we know today about mental illness, you would say, this is a highly dysfunctional household. But maybe they would look at the alcohol consumption in the household. But typically today, they would completely miss the role of the processed foods, the amount of sugar being consumed, the highly refined breakfast cereals, the milk, and the highly processed cheeses. These were cheap, they're cheap foods, and that's what we were eating. Nobody would have ever connected those with the fact that we fought all the time. So fast forward to, I'm age 31, 32, I'm having my two children, and I'm terrified that I will create that traumatic household for these two beautiful little girls. I am terrified of my children. Of course, I'm eating processed foods too at that point, and I'm yo-yo dieting. So what happened there is I went 10 years of personal therapy, and I did Codependence Anonymous, and I did a women's group. I did a lot of training with a women's group, all to get one thing under control, and that is raging. So I was one of those people who could just have a meltdown like that. I would be standing there perfectly normal 1 minute, and then the next minute I would be raging, just screaming at the top of my lungs. It was so traumatic for me that I would actually, I would disassociate. Part of me would go stand over here and watch the other part and just like, please stop that. Please stop screaming, stop yelling. And I wouldn't be able to do it. So all of that, I get to 1996, and I've done one more yo-yo diet cycle. I've regained the weight. I need a new approach. And somebody in my CODA group, it keeps telling me, go into food addicts in recovery. And I'm like, why would I do that? I'm thin right now. What's wrong with you? But what she heard was the sugar driving my behavior. Mm. So at the end of that year, I regained the weight. I went and got the book, and I turned straight to the food plan because I'm not a food addict. Oh, no. I'm just going to lose this weight. It's a classic mistake that everybody makes. This is an addiction that the most prominent consequence is this collection of fat tissue under our skin. The most hidden consequence is this complete rearrangement of the brain. Anyway, I went and got the book. I started January 1st, 1996. And within just moments, I knew that this food plan could not possibly work for weight loss because there was too much food. There was a lot of food. There were big servings of unprocessed foods. And I thought, well, I'm going to try it. But on day 4, weird, incredible things started happening. I lost the cravings, which I didn't know I had cravings because I'd always had them. Somebody asked me, do you have cravings? I would have said no. It didn't occur to me that I just thought about food all the time. I thought everybody did. My energy came up and my head cleared. So the brain fog lifted on day 4. And this is the thing that I just wish everybody in the world knew this. If you could just tough out those 4 days. If you're being put on a keto food plan, or if you're being put on a low carb food plan, tough it out for 4 days. Deal with the headache, deal with the fatigue, deal with the intensified cravings, deal with the stomach ache. Just hang in there because on day 4, you are going to pop out of it. Day 4, 5, 6, you're going to pop out of it. Just like coming up for air. Suddenly you're clear of it. Well, the days went on. At the end of that week, I weighed and I'd lost 2 pounds. And today I know it's because that's a food plan that stabilizes glucose, which means you're not pumping out insulin, and you're not, the insulin is not carrying sugar, all these processed carbs into your fat cells. So once you stop doing that, you start losing weight. And it's easy. Like, so all that starvation dieting that I had been doing all those years actually makes the food addiction worse. So I started to notice that my allergies got much better. The sinus infection that I'd had my entire life cleared up. The bloating stopped. I was in a better mood. I got to the end of the 3rd week, and I'm standing in my kitchen. I'm thinking, wow, I haven't had to yell at anybody in 3 weeks. Wow, nobody's really messed up in 3 weeks. Huh. And it just like it was like a bolt of lightning. Oh, this is not about my family having a miracle 3 weeks. This is about the food. And
your emotions.
This was about finally getting the source of that raging identified and under control. It was the elimination of sugars and flours in the food plan. It was the elimination of the sugars and flours. I mean, now I know that there are problems with dairy and excessive salt and processed fats and caffeine and food additives, but just letting go of the sugars and flours caused this unbelievable change in my behavior. And that is what got me started on this mission almost 24 years ago. So I did a lot of things to try to tell other people about this miraculous stuff. I stopped giving it to my kids because I thought, oh, yeah, great. I'm giving them food that makes them irritable with me. I'm going to stop doing that. I'm not going to do that. So I just said, hey, guys, I'm not giving you these things anymore, but I am going to give you this beautiful food. So circle everything you like. And then I was already a cook, and that made a big difference. So I started giving them clean food, and my 2 girls just rose to the top of their class in every area, in academics and extracurricular sports and art and spiritual, everything. They were amazing because all the other kids were grogged out on processed foods. I mean, if you have a child and you have ambition for that child, the last thing you would ever do is give them a processed food. And it's very easy for them to just rise to the top because everybody else is grogged out. They're drugged up. That's what these processed foods do. So I started out very naively. I said, well, I'll just give everybody a handout. No. I mean, today, from where I sit, I know we're dealing with a serious addiction. So it's just like saying to drinkers, hey, I have a great discovery. Stop drinking. No, it doesn't work that way at all. So then I said, well, it's probably because they don't know how to do it, because it's quite tricky to live outside the culture with your food. I spent 3 years writing a popular book, and it did great. But I really wanted everybody to know about these processed foods. And I was giving a lot of talks, and I developed a little one-on-one peer support practice. But then I did get to the point where I was being considered for a national TV show, one of those morning talk shows in New York. Like, I had already gone to the airport. I had survived 3 producer interviews. I was at the airport. I'd had to run and buy a suit. And there I was, ready to be flown to New York overnight to be on this show. And the last producer came on and said, well, it's down to you and a doctor, but we're going with the doctor because you don't have a degree in your field. I'm like, dang. Okay. I'll go get a degree in my field. I just did. I grew up in Cincinnati. Union Institute is there. It's a school specifically designed for new fields. And I went there and I just worked my tail off for 3 years and got through it. And I attracted this incredible committee. And we spent hours and hours on the phone. Like, how are we going to demonstrate this? How are we going to research processed food addiction? And we decided to take the diagnostic criteria for alcoholism. and see if when you applied those to overeating, whether that was a valid diagnostic questionnaire. At that time, it was 7 criteria. Now it's 11. And it popped. And we demonstrated the validity right out of the box with a fairly small sample. And so the whole committee became convinced that this disease does exist. And it illustrates one crucial thing, which is the science is there. The science is there. The science is what makes this real. When you do something like that, you validate the criteria for alcoholism, and you can diagnose an eating behavior with those criteria. That's very solid science. So I started writing chapters and papers for other people, and then I got a doctoral divorce. So if you ignore your spouse long enough, they will leave you. That's what happened. But I got this divorce settlement. I started a prepared meal company. I said, well, I'm still on the wrong model. I don't know it. They said, well, I'll just give them this nice, clean food. They'll feel so much better, and then they'll do it for themselves. No, that's still my big discovery is that you should stop drinking. No, this is a syndrome, and it's devastating. It impacts every cell in the body. And so I did learn that everybody has this. Everybody who came onto the food system got the same withdrawals, across a range of severity. The withdrawal syndromes, and then the release from fatigue, brain fog, and cravings. Pretty standard, but pretty devastating. If you have those, you're going to lead an impaired life without knowing it. If you have brain fog, fatigue, and depression, low grade, it is incredibly impairing, but you don't know it because you've always had it. It's what one of my mentors calls an unconscious impairment. It's like me with the cravings. I didn't know I had cravings. I'd always had them. So I eventually was approached by CRC Press to write the textbook, the processed food addiction textbook. Just happen to have a copy here. Here it is.
Fancy that, eh?
In 2016. And this ends the debate. The important thing about this book is it ends the debate. It's 240,000 words. It has 2,000 citations in it. It's got one chapter on each of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for alcoholism as adapted to eating, with all the evidence that behavior exists in eating processed foods. So it's over. And the question now is, okay, now that we have the scientific basis for processed food addiction, what do we do about it? And it's a very, very interesting question, because people have always said, oh, well, we lose the weight. No, that is not going to fix the mental problems. That's like saying to an emaciated heroin addict, a heroin addict who hasn't eaten in a long time because the addiction has taken over the feeding pathways. It's like saying, oh, heroin addict, just gain the weight. You'll be okay. No, you can't say to a processed food addict, oh, just lose the weight, you'll be okay. That is not going to work. So what you really have to address, and I'm going to be talking about this in BOCA for LowCarbUSA, you've got to address the mental illness. So addiction is a mental illness. There's a reason why the DSM-5, this is the DSM-5, this is a diagnostic manual for mental illnesses published by the American Psychiatric Association. There are 11 diagnostic criteria in here for alcoholism, and those are the behaviors that we describe in excruciating detail as appearing in processed food, compulsive processed food eaters. So you've got to start with the fact that you're dealing with a very severe mental illness. This is not a garden variety alcoholism, because most people will meet 6 or more of the criteria, which is the threshold for a serious addiction. And even before you can get to the addiction, there are all these spin-off mental illnesses: depression, irritability, severe anxiety. There's a tremendous cognitive impairment, which means you have attention deficit, learning disabilities, you have poor decision-making, poor impulse control, lack of ability to achieve satisfaction and satiation, and poor emotional processing. And then you have just the progression of the devastation of the disease. So you have things like Alzheimer's is definitely an outgrowth of this. We have really good evidence for that. And we're looking at new evidence for autism. Are the chemicals used to process these foods a factor in autism? So this will be the first time, I think, ever on the planet in Boca that we will be tying food addiction, which is a mental illness all in of itself, but we'll be tying food addiction to these epidemics of other mental illnesses. And I think if you're a practitioner, you've got to have that connection, because you've got to be able to look at somebody who's carrying an extra 100 pounds, or who is going to lose a foot to diabetes, or is headed towards a heart attack, or is going to have a stroke, and you've been standing by helplessly for years as they've gotten worse and worse and worse. The reason that that has happened in this model, this food addiction model, is because nobody has trained you in how to diagnose it and treat it. So we now know that in severe addictions, you've got to have a lot of hours of recovery airtime. You've got to be in a group of people for a lot of hours per day. The minimum for this severity of addiction would be an intensive outpatient program. And you're going to be so happy and excited when you are the person who actually gets to heal these clients, rather than medicate them or coach them for a couple of months and then have them relapse. All the frustration out of medical practices today are going to be resolved for you. So I hope you will come and hear this presentation in Boca. It will, I guarantee, it'll blow your socks off.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to that. We're going to have two other psychiatrists, psychologists speaking as well again. Will be really interesting conversation. And it's just something that's not talked about a lot. I think we talk a lot about, diet and lifestyle, but how does someone transition? How does somebody do that? And how do they feel about it? How do they feel in their lives? What has led to where they've gotten to, and how do you really help them?
You've been listening to an episode of the LowCarbUSA podcast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/LowCarbUSA.